Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button because today's story is going to leave you absolutely speechless. This is about how I discovered my wife's affair during her pregnancy and the calculated revenge that destroyed her perfect little fantasy. Trust me, you'll want to hear every single detail of how this played out, so let me paint you a picture. My wife Jessica and I had been married for 5 years, and we'd been trying to have a baby for almost 2 years. When she finally got pregnant, I was over the moon. I thought this was going to be the beginning of our perfect family life. Jessica was glowing, more beautiful than I'd ever seen her, and I was already planning how I was going to be the best father in the world. About 3 months into her pregnancy, Jessica announced she wanted to start taking yoga classes. It's supposed to be great for pregnant women, she said, showing me articles on her phone about prenatal yoga. It'll help with the delivery and keep me flexible and strong. I thought it was a wonderful idea. I even offered to pay for private lessons if that would make her more comfortable, but she insisted she wanted the social aspect of group classes. She found this studio called Zen Harmony about 20 minutes from our house. The instructor was this guy named Marcus, mid-30s, athletic build, one of those men who seemed to collect female admirers wherever he went. I met him once when I dropped Jessica off for a class, and something about his overly familiar smile rubbed me the wrong way. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I didn't want to be that jealous, controlling husband. Jessica started going to yoga 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Each class was supposed to be 90 minutes, but she'd always come home much later, usually around 3 hours after she left. "Oh, we went for smoothies afterward," she'd explain, or a few of us grabbed lunch to discuss pregnancy experiences. She always had a reasonable explanation, and she seemed so happy and relaxed after each session. I started noticing changes in her behavior around month 4. She was more attentive to her appearance, spending longer getting ready for yoga than she did for date nights with me. She bought new workout clothes, expensive designer pieces that seemed more suited for showing off than exercising. Her phone became attached to her hip, and she'd smile at messages in a way that made my stomach turn, though I couldn't explain why. The most obvious change was in her energy and mood. Jessica had always been somewhat reserved, especially about physical intimacy during the pregnancy, but after her yoga sessions, she'd come home glowing with this satisfied, almost post-workout high that seemed too intense for an hour and a half of stretching. She'd shower immediately after getting home, always claiming she was sweaty and gross, even though she never looked particularly disheveled. One Wednesday evening in her 6th month, I decided to surprise her by picking her up from class. I wanted to take her to dinner at this new Italian place she'd been talking about. When I arrived at Zen Harmony, the parking lot was nearly empty. Through the window, I could see the main studio was dark. A woman leaving the building told me the last class had ended 2 hours ago. My heart started pounding. Where was Jessica? I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. I drove around the area, checking nearby restaurants and cafes, but there was no sign of her or her car. Finally, around 9 p.m., she walked through our front door with that same post-yoga glow, carrying her mat and water bottle like nothing was wrong. "How was dinner, babe?" she asked, kissing my cheek. "The restaurant was so busy, we ended up just getting appetizers and talking for hours." I stared at her, processing the lie. "Which restaurant?" "That little cafe next to the studio. You know, the one with the outdoor seating." I'd driven past that cafe. It had been closed for renovations for the past month, with construction tape across the entrance. That night I lay awake replaying every detail of the past few months. Jessica's new clothes, her secretive phone behavior, the extended yoga sessions, her improved mood and energy levels. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore anymore. The next morning after Jessica left for work, I called Zen Harmony. A cheerful receptionist answered and confirmed what I already suspected. There was no Wednesday evening prenatal class. In fact, Marcus only taught prenatal yoga on Saturday mornings. When I asked about private sessions, she told me Marcus did offer those, but they were held at his home studio, not at Zen Harmony. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My pregnant wife had been lying to me for months about where she was spending 9 hours a week. The woman carrying what I thought was my child was having an affair, and I'd been too trusting and naive to see the obvious signs. But instead of confronting her immediately, something calculating took over my mind. I needed to know everything before I made my next move. I needed proof, details, and most importantly, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with in Marcus. That afternoon, I started what became the most thorough investigation of my life. I began by researching Marcus Rivera. Yes, I'd learned his full name from the studio's website. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. He was 34, divorced twice, and had a pattern of relationships with his female students. His social media was filled with photos of him in yoga poses with various women, many of whom appeared to be pregnant or new mothers. Digging deeper into public records, I discovered Marcus had been sued twice, once for sexual harassment by a former student, and once for breach of promise in a relationship that ended when the woman discovered he was simultaneously involved with 2 other students. Both cases had been settled out of court, which suggested he had enough money to make problems disappear quietly. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in marital infidelity cases. Within a week, she provided me with documentation that confirmed my worst fears. Jessica and Marcus were meeting at his apartment every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The sessions lasted anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, and based on the photographs Sarah took from a distance, very little yoga was actually happening. The most damning evidence came from Sarah's surveillance of Marcus's building. She documented Jessica entering his apartment building and not emerging for hours. She photographed them together on his balcony, sharing intimate moments that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. In one particularly clear shot, Marcus had his hands on Jessica's pregnant belly in a possessive, intimate way that made me sick to my stomach. But Sarah's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Jessica wasn't Marcus's only pregnant student. She documented at least 2 other women who followed the same pattern, claiming to attend yoga classes while actually spending hours at Marcus's apartment. It appeared that preying on vulnerable pregnant women was Marcus's specialty, and my wife had walked right into his trap. Armed with this information, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Jessica immediately, I was going to let her affair continue while I planned the perfect revenge. But first, I needed to know something that was eating away at me. Was the baby actually mine? I scheduled a paternity test without Jessica's knowledge. During one of her yoga sessions, I collected DNA samples from items she'd used, a hairbrush, a drinking glass, personal items that would contain her genetic material. The test required samples from both parents and the unborn child, which could be obtained through amniocentesis. Convincing Jessica to have amniocentesis required some manipulation on my part. I expressed concerns about genetic disorders, showed her articles about the importance of prenatal testing, and eventually convinced her it was the responsible thing to do for our baby's health. She agreed, never suspecting my true motive. 2 weeks later, the results arrived in a plain envelope that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I sat in my car in an empty parking lot, hands shaking as I opened it. The genetic analysis was conclusive. The baby Jessica was carrying was not mine. I sat there for over an hour, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. Not only had my wife been having an affair, but she'd been letting me believe I was going to be a father to another man's child. She'd been accepting my excitement, my plans for the future, my emotional investment in a pregnancy that had nothing to do with me. That night, I looked at Jessica across the dinner table as she talked enthusiastically about baby names and nursery decorations, and I felt absolutely nothing. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd loved and trusted, didn't actually exist. In her place was a stranger who'd been manipulating me for months, while carrying another man's child. But my revenge was going to be methodical and complete. I wasn't going to just expose the affair. I was going to systematically destroy the fantasy life she'd built with Marcus, and make sure both of them faced consequences for their actions. I started by researching Marcus's business more thoroughly.
His yoga studio was struggling financially. He was 3 months behind on rent and had several unpaid business loans. His expensive lifestyle was being funded by private yoga sessions with wealthy married women, essentially running a high-end escort service disguised as wellness coaching. Next, I looked into Jessica's finances. She'd been spending money I didn't know about, payments to Marcus that were labeled as yoga sessions but were far more than any legitimate classes would cost. She'd also been purchasing expensive gifts, lingerie, and making hotel reservations on days when I thought she was at work. My plan began with Marcus. I scheduled a meeting with him, claiming I wanted to surprise Jessica with private couples yoga sessions. When I arrived at his apartment, I was wearing a hidden recording device. I told him I was concerned about my wife's emotional state during pregnancy and asked if he'd noticed anything unusual during their sessions. Marcus, clearly uncomfortable with the direct questioning, tried to deflect, but I pressed him, mentioning that Jessica had seemed much happier and more energetic after starting yoga, and wondering if he had any insight into what might be causing such a positive change in her demeanor. Well, he said, clearly trying to choose his words carefully, Jessica is a very special woman. She's going through a beautiful transformation, and I think our sessions provide her with a sense of connection and fulfillment that maybe she wasn't getting elsewhere. I asked him to elaborate on what he meant by connection and fulfillment, and Marcus began talking about the spiritual and physical bond that could develop between a yoga instructor and student. He described their relationship in terms that were clearly romantic and sexual, though he tried to disguise it in New Age spiritual language. The recording was perfect. Marcus had essentially confessed to having an inappropriate relationship with my pregnant wife, and I had it all documented. My next step was gathering evidence of Jessica's deception. I installed monitoring software on our shared computer and discovered she'd been maintaining a secret email account where she and Marcus exchanged explicit messages about their relationship and future plans. The emails revealed that Marcus had convinced Jessica he was in love with her and wanted to raise the baby together after she divorced me. Even more disturbing, their messages included detailed discussions about my assets, our house, my business, and how much money Jessica might be able to get in a divorce settlement. Marcus had essentially been coaching her on how to maximize her financial gain when she eventually left me. They'd been planning this betrayal for months, treating me like a financial resource rather than a human being. The emails also revealed that Jessica had told Marcus the baby was mine, and he'd been encouraging her to continue the deception until after the birth, when they could figure out the best way to handle the situation. Neither of them seemed particularly concerned about the impact their lies might have on me or the child. With all my evidence collected, I was ready to execute my revenge. But I wanted the confrontation to be public and humiliating, something that would expose both Jessica and Marcus for who they really were. I scheduled a surprise baby shower for Jessica, inviting both our families, her friends from work, and several women from the yoga studio, including the other pregnant women I suspected were also involved with Marcus. I told everyone it was going to be a surprise celebration of Jessica's pregnancy, and that I had some special announcements to make. The day of the shower, Jessica came home from one of her yoga sessions to find our house decorated and filled with people. She seemed genuinely surprised and touched by what she thought was a loving gesture from her devoted husband. Marcus wasn't there, of course. I'd told Jessica it was a women-only event. After everyone had eaten and Jessica had opened her gifts, I stood up to make a toast. I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate this special time in our lives, I began, watching Jessica's face glow with happiness. Pregnancy has been such a journey for Jessica and me, and I've learned so much about the woman I married. I paused, pulling out a folder of documents. For instance, I learned that Jessica has been taking yoga classes 3 times a week for the past 6 months. I've been so impressed by her dedication to staying healthy during pregnancy. Jessica smiled, probably wondering where I was going with this. I was so inspired by her commitment that I decided to research her yoga instructor, Marcus Rivera, to see if I could book some couples sessions as a surprise. Jessica's face went pale. But the interesting thing I discovered is that Marcus doesn't actually teach the classes Jessica has been attending. In fact, the studio told me he only does private sessions at his apartment. The room had gone completely silent. Jessica was staring at me with growing horror, and her mother was looking confused and concerned. So I hired a private investigator to find out exactly what kind of yoga my wife has been practicing. I began passing around the photographs Sarah had taken, images of Jessica entering Marcus's building, sitting with him on his balcony, embracing him in ways that left no doubt about their relationship. As you can see, Jessica has been very flexible in her yoga practice. Jessica started crying, but I wasn't finished. The most interesting discovery came when I decided to be responsible about our baby's health and arranged for genetic testing. I pulled out the paternity test results. It turns out that the child Jessica is carrying isn't mine, which makes sense considering she's been having unprotected sex with her yoga instructor for the past 6 months. The explosion of shock, gasps, and outraged voices was everything I'd hoped for. Jessica's mother started screaming at her. My mother started crying, and several of the women from the yoga studio were looking at each other with dawning realization that they might not be the only ones Marcus had been instructing. But I still had one more reveal. I also discovered that Marcus has been coaching Jessica on how to maximize her divorce settlement from me. They've been planning this affair as a business transaction, treating me like an ATM while building their future together with my money. I played several audio recordings from the emails, including Jessica's voice saying things like, "He'll never suspect anything until it's too late, and we just need to wait until after the baby is born and then we can take him for everything he's worth." Jessica tried to run from the room, but her mother blocked her path, demanding explanations. The confrontation that followed was brutal and satisfying. Jessica's family was horrified by her deception. My family was rallying around me with support and outrage, and several of the yoga studio women were realizing they'd been played by the same man. Within hours, word had spread throughout our social circle about Jessica's affair and deception. By the next day, Marcus was facing inquiries from multiple husbands whose wives had been taking his private yoga lessons. His business reputation was destroyed, and several women were threatening to expose his predatory behavior publicly. Jessica tried to salvage the situation by claiming she was confused and emotional because of pregnancy hormones, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The emails, photos, and genetic testing painted a clear picture of calculated deception rather than a moment of weakness. I filed for divorce immediately, using the evidence I'd gathered to ensure Jessica received nothing in the settlement. Since the child wasn't mine, I had no financial obligations for child support. Since she'd committed adultery and attempted to defraud me, she lost any claim to our assets. The divorce was finalized before the baby was born. Jessica gave birth to a son who looked exactly like Marcus. Same dark hair, same facial structure, no resemblance to me whatsoever. Marcus, faced with the reality of supporting a child and a woman with no money, quickly lost interest in playing house with Jessica. Within 6 months of the baby's birth, Marcus had moved on to his next pregnant victim, and Jessica was a single mother working 2 jobs to support herself and a child whose father wanted nothing to do with either of them. The other women from the yoga studio also discovered they'd been manipulated by Marcus. 2 of them were carrying his children, and one had left her husband believing Marcus was going to marry her. When his pattern of behavior became public, his yoga studio lost its lease. He faced multiple lawsuits, and he eventually had to leave town to escape the consequences of his actions. As for me, the experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, evidence, and the importance of verifying what people tell you rather than accepting it blindly. I kept the house, my business, and my dignity. Most importantly, I learned that I'm much stronger and more capable than I ever realized. 3 years later, I'm remarried to a woman who values honesty and commitment as much as I do. We have a daughter together, and every day I'm grateful for the life I built after escaping Jessica's web of lies. Sometimes people ask me if I regret being so methodical in my revenge rather than just confronting Jessica privately. The answer is no. She made calculated decisions to betray me for months, treating me like a fool while planning to steal my resources and destroy my future. Her humiliation was proportional to her deception, and the public exposure protected other potential victims from Marcus's predatory behavior. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Jessica's world fall apart. It was knowing that I'd taken control of a situation where I was being manipulated and turned it completely around. Instead of being the victim of someone else's plan, I became the architect of justice. That's the power of patience, evidence, and strategic thinking. When someone betrays your trust, don't react emotionally. Gather information, document everything, and then execute your response in a way that ensures they face real consequences for their actions. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've experienced betrayal in your own relationships, remember that knowledge is power, and the truth always comes to light eventually. Make sure to subscribe for more stories about justice, revenge, and people getting exactly what they deserve.